Johann of Leyden and the New Jerusalem in Munster. In 1534 and 1535, the persecuted Anabaptists in Switzerland and southern and central Germany fled north, to northern Germany, Holland, Sweden, and Denmark. The center of their activity became the town of Munster, where they established themselves at the time of the struggle between the Catholics and the Lutherans. They gained a strong position in the town, by allying themselves with the Lutherans. But when the Lutherans won, they found they had to reckon with the prophets, as the leaders of the Anabaptists described themselves. The latter had even succeeded in winning over the head of the Lutheran party. At this time, a new and striking figure appeared among the Anabaptists, Jan Mathematician, a Dutch baker from Haarlem. In his preaching, the chiliastic and militant tendencies in Anabaptism were resurrected with their previous force. Mathematician called for armed rebellion and the universal extermination of the godless. Apostles sent by him went in pairs to all lands and provinces. They told about the miracles wrought by this new prophet, and predicted the annihilation of all tyrants and godless people in the world. In Germany and in Holland, people underwent the second baptism, and founded new communities. In Munster, 1,400 persons were baptized in 8 days. In keeping with the growing success of the Anabaptists there, adherents from other countries, especially from Holland, streamed into Munster. The Dutch arrivals were headed by the Munster citizen Nipperdeling, one of Mathematician's apostles. To arrive in Munster was Jan Bokkelsen, Bukels, who, under the name Johann of Leyden, was to become a central figure in later developments. Beginning as a tailor's apprentice, Bokkelsen married a rich widow, but soon lost her fortune. He had travelled much, having been to England, Flanders, and Portugal, had read fairly extensively, and knew the Holy Scriptures as well as Munster's writings. In Munster he took up with Nipperdeling, and soon married his daughter, thereby bringing the Anabaptist community under the influence of Mathematician. By this time, leadership of the Anabaptist movement in Munster had passed over from the local citizens entirely into the hands of the Dutch prophets, preacher conspirators who had been uprooted from their homeland. Clashes between Anabaptists and Lutherans occurred in Munster, and Anabaptists raided monasteries and churches. Mathematician's apostles proclaimed that the 1,000-year kingdom was at hand for those who had accepted the second baptism, a happy life with community of property, without authority, laws or marital bonds. As for those who opposed the new kingdom, they could expect annihilation and death at the hand of the chosen. The chosen were prohibited to greet the faithless or to have anything whatever to do with them. The municipal council banished some Anabaptist preachers from the town, and arrested one who had violated the ban imposed on their sermons. This was early in 1534. Crowds of Anabaptists ran through the city, shouting, "Repent or God will punish you. Father, Father, annihilate the godless." On the 9th of February, armed mobs appeared in the town. They blocked off streets, and occupied part of the city. The Lutherans also took up arms, occupied another part of town, and began to push the Anabaptists back. Their forces proved to be greater, and they surrounded the Anabaptists, and brought up cannon. Victory was in the hands of the Lutherans, but the burgomaster Tilbeck, who sympathized with the Anabaptists, negotiated an agreement on religious peace, quote, "so that everyone be free in his faith and every man come back to his own house, and live in peace." End quote. This was the beginning of Anabaptist rule in the town. Anabaptists flocked to Munster from all sides. In an account that originated in Anabaptist circles, we read, quote, "The faces of Christians again blossomed forth. Everyone in the marketplace, even 7-year-old children, began prophesying. The women made extraordinary jumps, but the godless said that they were demented, that they were drunk on sweet wine." End quote. On February 21, a new election was held for the municipal council, in which the Anabaptists won a majority. They took over the municipal administration, and appointed their adherents Nipperdeling and Kabenbrock as burgomasters. The Anabaptists made a display of their power almost immediately in a terrible outburst of violence that took place on February 24, 3 days after the election. Monasteries and churches were destroyed, religious objects smashed, and saints' relics thrown into the streets. Not only religion but everything connected with the old culture evoked their ire. Statues in the market square were smashed to pieces. A precious collection of old Italian manuscripts which had been collected by Rudolf von Langen was solemnly burned in the square. Paintings of the Westphalian school, famous at the time, were destroyed so thoroughly that at present this school of painting is known only by reputation. Even musical instruments were smashed. 3 days later, on February 27, the Anabaptists proceeded to one of the major points of their program, the expulsion of the godless, that is, of those citizens who refused to accept the teachings of the prophets. Mathematicians insisted that all the godless be put to death. The more wary Nipodilling objected, all peoples will then unite against us to revenge the blood of those killed. Finally, a decision was taken to drive out of town anyone who refused to accept second baptism. A meeting of armed Anabaptists was called. The prophet sat in a trance, while prayers were being said. At last, Mathematicians rose and called for the expulsion of the faithless. Down with Esau's offspring, the inheritance belongs to the children of Jacob. A shout of "Down with the godless" rolled through the streets. Armed Anabaptists broke into houses and drove out everyone who was unwilling to accept second baptism. Winter was drawing to a close. It was a stormy day and wet snow was falling. An eyewitness account describes crowds of expelled citizens walking through the knee-deep snow. They had not been allowed even to take warm clothing with them, women carrying children in their arms, old men leaning on staffs. At the city gate they were robbed once more. The next action was the socialization of all property. A chronicle of the time reads, quote, "They decided unanimously that all property must be held in common, and that everyone must hand in his silver, gold and money. In the end all did so." End quote. It is known that this measure was accomplished with some difficulty, and only in the course of 2 months. Mathematicians appointed 7 deacons to watch over the socialized property. To suppress discontent aroused by these measures, the Anabaptists began to resort to terror on an ever wider scale. One day Mathematicians gathered all the men in the town square, and ordered everyone who had taken baptism on the last day, mass baptism had gone on for 3 days, to step forward. There were 300, they were ordered to put down their arms. Mathematicians spoke, "The Lord is wrathful and calls for sacrifice." The accused men prostrated themselves before the prophet, in the manner of the Anabaptists, and begged for mercy, but they were locked in a deserted church, from which their appeals for mercy could be heard for hours. Finally, Jan Bockelson appeared and announced, "My dear brethren, the Lord has taken pity upon you," and all were released. But things did not always end so benignly. For example, a report was received that the blacksmith Hubert Ruscha had spoken against the actions of the Anabaptists. He was brought to a meeting. Mathematicians demanded his death. Some of those present interceded for the man, and asked that he be pardoned, but Bockelson shouted, "To me the power of the Lord is given, so that by my hand everyone who opposes the commands of the Lord be struck down," and he struck Ruscha with a halberd. The wounded man was led away to jail. Disputation as to his fate continued. Finally, the man was again brought to the town square, where Mathematicians killed him with a shot in the back. Streams of incendiary Anabaptist literature flowed from Munster, calling the brethren to come together in the New Jerusalem, for, quote, "Bed and shelter are ready for all Christians. If there will be too many people, we shall use the houses and the property of the faithless. Here you will have everything in abundance. The poorest among us, who earlier were scorned as paupers, now wear rich clothing like the highest and the noblest. The poor have become, by God's grace, as rich as burgomasters." End quote. It was reported that at Easter the world would be struck by a terrible plague and that, outside Munster, only every 10th person would be spared. Quote, "Let no one think either of husband, or of wife or of child, if they are faithless. Do not take them with you, they are useless to God's community. If anyone remains behind, I'm innocent of his blood." End quote. The censer leaflet signed Emmanuel, the book Restitution or Revival of the True Christian Teaching, was sent far and wide. It asserts that truth had been only partly open to Erasmus, Zwingli and Luther, but that it shone forth in Mathematicians and Johann of Leyden. Much importance is attached to the Old Testament. The kingdom of Christ on earth is conceived of in a purely physical fashion. It includes communality of property and polygamy. The book ends with the words, quote, "In our time, Christians are allowed to turn the sword against godless authorities." End quote. The booklet concerning vengeance was another popular work. It is nothing less than a call to murder and revenge. Only after vengeance had been carried out would the new earth and the new heaven appear to God's people. Quote, "Remember what they have done unto us, all this must be visited upon them in a like manner. Heed this and do not consider us in what is no sin." End quote. Apostles were sent from Munster to propagandize insurrection and to drum up support for the New Jerusalem. They were particularly successful in Holland. Erasmus Schet wrote to Erasmus of Rotterdam, quote, "Hardly is there a town or a city, where the ashes of rebellion are not smouldering. The communism that they preach attracts masses from all sides." End quote. In many towns the rebaptized were counted in the hundreds, among them many influential people. In Cologne it was reported that 700 had been newly baptized, and in Essen, 200. Turbulence grew apace. One day 5 naked men, with swords in hand, ran through Amsterdam foretelling the imminent end of the world. Large crowds of armed Anabaptists were moving toward Munster. 1,600 gathered in Vollenhove. 30 ships with armed Anabaptists aboard left Amsterdam, and landed near Genemuiden. This was followed by 21 more ships with 3,000 men, women, and children. The Dutch authorities were able to disperse these crowds only with great difficulty. In the town of Warenberg, an Anabaptist community began accumulating weapons, and the burgomaster became so frightened that he would appear only accompanied by 100 guards. In Munster the prophet Johann compiled a list of towns which were soon to be controlled by the children of God. First on the list was Soest. A delegation of prophets set out for this city. They entered the town openly and solemnly, preaching insurrection. The authorities managed to oust them with great difficulty. It is not surprising that this movement alarmed Bishop Franz von Waldeck, in whose domain Munster was situated, as well as the rulers of the neighboring areas. Slowly an army was raised and Munster besieged. The town was well fortified, and had large stores of provisions. The siege was a hard one, lasting 14 months. One of the first victims of the war turned out to be the Anabaptist leader Mathematician. During a common meal, he exclaimed, "Let thy will be done and not mine." Then he bade the others farewell, kissing them. It appears that he had had a vision, that he was to challenge the unfaithful to a fight in the manner of Samson. The next day he actually went outside the city wall with a small group of volunteers, and was hacked to pieces by the landsquenets. His comrade in arms Bokkelson, Johann of Leyden, thereupon delivered a sermon, quote, "God will give you another prophet who will be more powerful. God desired the death of Mathematician, lest you should believe in him more than in God." End quote. Within several days, Bokkelson became that new prophet, the heir to Mathematician. Once the Lord closed Johann's lips for 3 days. Upon recovering his speech, he proclaimed that he had had a revelation about a new order for the town. The power of the council was to be abolished, and 12 elders were to govern under the leadership of the prophet. The names of the elders were announced. They turned out to be the most influential Dutch prophets, and they were installed without any election. Next came what was perhaps the most radical innovation, establishment of polygamy. Ideas of this sort are encountered earlier in Anabaptist preachings. They were supported by reference to the customs of the patriarchs of the Old Testament. The new law was facilitated by the fact that after banishment of the godless, there were 2 or 3 times as many women in Munster as men. The introduction of polygamy was accompanied by a regulation in accordance with which all women whose age did not prevent it were obligated to have a husband. The sharing out of women began. Eyewitnesses tell of violence and suicides. The atmosphere in which the law was implemented is intimated by another law, which forbade men to break into houses in groups to choose wives. One can only imagine what life was like in the new families. The authorities also interfered by staging frequent public punishment of recalcitrant wives. The socialization of property in polygamy evoked considerable opposition in the town. The disaffected seized the chief prophets, and demanded abolition of these regulations, but they were surrounded by Anabaptists still loyal to Bokkelson, mostly Dutchmen and Frisians, and compelled to surrender. They were tied to trees and shot. "Whoever fires the first shot does a service to God," Bokkelson cried. The defeat of the opposition within coincided with a major military victory. A large force assaulting the town had been beaten back. The army of the attackers was badly organized, and apparently there were Anabaptists in its ranks, for the time set for the assault had become known in Munster. The losses of the besieging army were such that a daring sally could have destroyed it entirely. These events strengthened Johann's position considerably. The prophet Du Centre reported that he had had a vision that Johann would become king of the world, and take the throne and the scepter of his father David until the coming of the Lord himself. Bokkelson confirmed that he had had the same vision. The election of the king culminated in the singing of psalms. Bokkelson surrounded himself with a splendid court, created court posts of various kinds and a detachment of bodyguards. He took new wives constantly, among whom the first was the most lovely of all women, Devora, Mathematician's widow. 2 crowns encrusted with precious stones, one royal, the other imperial, were made for Bokkelson. His emblem was the globe with 2 swords crossed, a symbol of his power over the world. The king appeared with a fanfare, and accompanied by a mounted guard. A hofmeister marched in front, carrying a white staff. Splendidly dressed pages followed, one bearing a sword, the other the Old Testament. Next came the court, dressed in silk. Everyone they met had to kneel. At the same time, Johann had a vision from which he learned that no one should possess more than one coat, 2 pairs of stockings, 3 shirts and so on. Everyone outside the royal court was bound by this revelation. One day 4,200 citizens were called to a royal banquet. The king and queen played host, and everyone sang the hymn Glory to God in the highest. Suddenly Johann noticed among the guests someone who seemed alien to him. He was not in nuptial dress. Deciding that this must be Judas, the king cut off his head on the spot. Thereupon the banquet resumed. Theatrical performances were staged for the townspeople. Some of these parodied the holy service, others took a social turn. For instance, the dialogue of the rich man with Lazarus. Streets and all important buildings in the town were renamed. Babies were given newly invented names. Meanwhile executions took place almost daily. For example, on the 3rd of June, 1535, 52 persons were executed. On the 5th of June, 18 persons on both the 6th and the 7th, etc. Obstinate wives were executed, as well as a woman who had spoken against the new order. One woman who refused to become the king's wife, in spite of his several proposals, had her head chopped off in the town square by the king's own hand, while his assembled wives sang Glory to God in the highest. The entire episode has the appearance of mass pathology, a madness to which the prophets themselves eventually fell victim, when with blind fanaticism they joined their destinies to a doomed cause. But was it really? The monster episode demonstrates a multitude of traits typical of all revolutions, but where, confined to a single town, and compressed into a single year, tragedy turns into a grotesque farce. The Swiftian device of attributing the vices of the world to tiny Lilliputians was here employed by history. In actual fact, the most eccentric of actions proved to have been entirely consistent with the inner logic of the movement. Extreme fanaticism stirred the Anabaptist mob and spread to larger and larger masses of people. Behind the absurd posturings of Jan Bockelson we can often discern a sly and calculating mind, examples of which we shall encounter later. Apparently, both he and the other prophets had a very concrete goal in mind: universal rebellion and the establishment of themselves in power, if not over the entire world, then at least over a large part of Europe. Although these hopes were not realized, they should not be dismissed as having been entirely groundless. Unrest was rampant in the whole of northwestern Germany and in Holland. It was widely thought at the time that, if Johann would succeed in breaking through the siege, he would foster a change in the course of history comparable to the Great Migration of Peoples. Anabaptist emissaries were active as far away as Zurich and Bern. In Munster they enticed landsquinets to their side with large salaries. The besieging force was once seized by panic over the rumor that the Anabaptists had taken Lubeck. This turned out to be untrue, but it is symptomatic of the prevailing sentiment. There was, apparently, a plan to raise rebellion in 4 places simultaneously. It was partially implemented. In Frisia, Anabaptists seized and fortified a monastery, where they held out against a prolonged siege. Victory cost the Imperial Army 900 men killed. A squadron of Anabaptist ships approached Deventer intent on taking the town, but it was intercepted by the Duke of Heldern's fleet. Outside Groningen, an Anabaptist force of some 1,000 men gathered, intending to break through to Munster. It too was scattered by the Duke's men, but the Anabaptists were strongest in Holland, the homeland of Mathematician and Jan Bockelson. In 1535, several large detachments of Anabaptists assembled there. They even succeeded in seizing the Amsterdam town hall for a time, although the authorities soon had the situation in hand. One of the reasons for the movement's failure was that its plans became known to the enemy. One of Johann's apostles fell into the hands of the bishop, and promised to disclose the Anabaptists' battle plans in exchange for his life. He returned to Munster, pretending to have escaped, then set out again on an apostolic mission, and informed the bishop of everything. We can conclude that Bockelson's aspirations were far from illusory. He had amassed an army, and was ready to break the siege, should the Dutch come to his aid. He was constructing a mobile barricade made of carriages. At night he ran around the town barefoot, wearing nothing but a shirt and shouting, "Rejoice, Israel, salvation is at hand." At one point he summoned the entire army to the square in order to move out of the town. He then appeared, wearing his crown and royal garments, and declared that the day had not yet come, and that he had simply wanted to check the readiness of his forces. A feast was prepared for the populace. There were some 2,000 men and 8,000 women altogether. After the meal, Johann suddenly announced that he was stepping down, but the prophet du censure proclaimed that God called upon his brother Johann of Leyden to remain king, and to punish the iniquitous. Bokelson was re-elected. There were apparently real frictions behind this masquerade. On another occasion, for instance, Nipperdeling started to leap and dance about strangely. He even stood on his head. But in the midst of these antics he suddenly cried out, "Johann is king of the flesh, but I shall be king of the spirit." Bokelson ordered him locked in the tower, as a result of which Nipperdeling soon thought better of things and the two were reconciled. Another political move in a similarly fantastic guise was the election of dukes. A secret vote was taken in the 12 districts into which the town had been divided. The names of candidates were put into a hat, and drawn out by specially appointed young boys. The dukes elected in this manner all turned out to be prophets close to Bokelson. Each received a dukedom of the empire, that is, one of the town districts, together with control of the town gate located in the corresponding district. This last point was the real meaning of the whole enterprise, for the landsquinates, whom Johann could no longer trust, were thereby removed from strategic positions in defense of the town. These political maneuvers were supplemented by the sight of the royal guards engaging in daily military exercises on the main square. In the end, however, a large stockpile of provisions ran out, and famine set in. The horses were eaten, and this destroyed any hope of breaking the siege. The deacons confiscated all stores, and under threat of death it was forbidden to bake bread at home. All houses were searched and no one had the right to lock his door. The citizens began to eat grass and roots. The king pronounced that this was no worse than bread. At this moment, he called together the dukes, the court and all his wives to a luxurious feast in the palace. An eyewitness who later escaped from the town reported, quote, "They behaved as though they were planning to rule for the rest of their lives." End quote. Fanaticism served as a lightning rod. The king commanded that all that is high shall be destroyed, and the citizens began to destroy belfries and the tops of towers. Repression was practiced ever more widely. New conspiracies were revealed constantly. One of those accused was hacked into 12 parts, and a Dutchman ate his heart and liver. The town was doomed. More and more of the defenders fled, despite the fact that trial, torture and possible execution awaited them in the besiegers' camp. Finally, on July 25, 1535, Munster was taken. The reign of the Anabaptists, who had come to power February 21, 1534, had lasted for a year and a half. Many of them were massacred by the landsquinates during the final assault, others were tried and many executed. Munster was no longer an evangelic city, it had returned to the realm of the Catholic bishop. Jan Bokelson hid in the most impregnable tower, but later gave himself up. Under torture, he renounced his faith, and acknowledged that he deserved death 10 times over. He promised that, if his life was spared, he would bring all Anabaptists to obedience, but to no avail. In the square where once he had sat on a throne, he was tortured with hot irons, and then his heart was pierced with a red-hot dagger.